me having been in public health, I have a better insight, but most folks don't have any idea that public health all over responds to things. And I mentioned like tuberculosis, whooping cough outbreaks, like all the time. The good thing is most folks don't know because it's kind of like this. It's kind of freaky to know what diseases are in your backyard.
G'day everyone, Craig from People with a Passion, and I appreciate you being here, and I hope you're safe and well given the current crisis. If you haven't yet supported the channel, then please take a moment to hit the subscribe button to help people like me who create content. The easiest way you can do that is by subscribing and also liking and or commenting on the video. If you haven't yet hit the notification bell, do that as well, because that'll advise you when new People with a Passion interviews are actually uploaded. Today's guest is the host of the People, Process, Progress podcast. Kevin Pannell is his name, and he works in crisis management, emergency response, and incident response. And he's going to be giving us a perspective across organisational, business, and individual perspectives around mitigating against the current risks in the current crisis. So I hope you grab yourself a drink or something, sit down, relax, and watch and or listen to this episode of People with a Passion with Kevin Pannell. Today's episode is brought to you by Applaudible.net. Thanks for joining us on the show, Kevin Pannell. I really appreciate your time and your experience that you're going to share with us today around emergency project management and also what you're currently doing in the IT project management space with health as well. So thanks for joining us on People with a Passion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm definitely passionate about, process and bringing people together and with my background in military medicine and emergency management, public health in particular. It's a great opportunity, I think, for us to talk about that a bit.
Give us a little bit of your background, because you've had some military experience and you also have and currently work in a space where you are in a health environment, and they're not exactly the same, but they both are still project management. But let's talk about your naval history first and what your role was and how that may relate to what's going on right now.
Sure. I was a hospital corpsman in the U.S. Navy for almost 6 years. And so the cool thing about being in the Navy and a corpsman, and I worked in critical care, is your kind of scope of practice under Department of Defense is pretty high, and for corpsmen in particular. So I got to do a lot of things in the critical care area, from starting IVs to reading 12-lead EKGs, very, hands-on, a lot of the stuff that are, hardworking folks out in the hospitals all over are doing now. And I was assigned and went across the Atlantic, actually, on the Comfort, the ship that's in New York right now. And so that background for sure gives me an appreciation for, that's where I got my really heavy medical experience, night shift, day shift, all the different things. And my first touch into event management or event support, really, because I was really an operations person, part of a bigger plan that I didn't realize then down the road, as I got more experience, I would kind of learn that. But, supporting big events like, NATO's 50th anniversary and being able to stage in the Capitol in case, someone got hurt or sick. And so that was a good opportunity. And again, kind of the peak of my skill set with, advanced cardiac life support and things like that. So it's also, again, really neat to see the comfort on a new mission with this pandemic that we have now in New York, and kind of picturing me from, mopping or swabbing the deck through actually doing patient care on the same ship and thinking about what they're going through now.
That experience on that ship, you would certainly, like you say, be able to relate to those individuals that are in a crisis right now. Like when we say all hands on deck as a cliche, but right. What would their day be entailing right now? What is going on that ship?
For sure, all hands on deck for when, from when you get the order or before, to get the ship ready, literally cleaning it, getting all the, the equipment ready, staging it, getting ready to sail, as they say, to briefing in your groups, I worked in casualty receiving, which was like the ER on the ship. I worked in the intensive care unit at Bethesda Naval Hospital, but on the ship, I was primarily in that casualty receiving. So getting your teams that work in kind of the pods or like the ER spaces, and okay, let's walk through a code, or a sick person comes in, or what, especially now, what personal protective equipment, do we need to have ready? What level do we wear depending on the patient? So you're really pre-planning scenarios for different types of medical patients or different screening scenarios. And it looks like I was actually just looking at some of the videos, which is the Navy's doing great. They're pushing out, experience on the Mercy. That's the Comfort sister ship, and the Comfort, and you can get some insight. But seeing the same kind of area is very military looking, but the all hands for sure, when you have it's a very well rehearsed, whether it's a pretty stable patient that comes in or a very sick, unstable patient, that people know their role ahead of time. The all hands is, who's going to start the IV, who's going to get the catheter, who's going to get the supplies, who's going to record. And so it's a microcosm of the bigger team with every single patient. And then you multiply that by the, hundreds of patients that they're, either have or are going to get it, just over and over again.
The ships are there to actually support in that role. Normally, obviously, war, but this is a war footing as far
Right.
as the invisible enemy that people are talking of. So, you said that you're no longer in the military, but you have had interactions with some of those on the ground from your that are colleagues that you've worked with, and you have worked in a project management role in that emergency health environment. So even though you're not being paid to consult, there is a bit of back and forth, and you still have a little bit of input into what your opinion on some of what's happening is. You have a strategy around management called the SMART strategy. Do you want to explain what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So, after the Navy, I got into IT management, and down the road a little bit, got into public health emergency management, and then on an incident management team. And you learn all these different principles. And so I became what's called a planning section chief, which means, I'm like a project manager, where you could drop me with the team in. I can facilitate a process with anyone, whether it's a big fire, or it's a building, or it's a pandemic. For me, being the public health guy that got into emergency management or incident management, I definitely latched onto the process. And so between that and looking at then the project management side, and again, the all hazards incident management planning section chief is very similar to like a project manager, whether it's construction or information technology or anything, because we're kind of keepers of the process. We help people communicate, we facilitate, but we don't really own stuff. We're there to support the operations people that are doing the work on the ground or in the office or, wherever it is. And so taking all these different methodologies, and folks can look up the incident command system, and there's tons of resources, just, Googling or something like that, or even, and same thing, project management. There's just so much stuff out there. And from, getting my project management professional credential and then getting credential in incident management, distilling down, and some of this was from great mentors I had, where we were told there's these big three that can help solve any problem. So if you're in a bind, it's just, it's just going nuts, is focus on those SMART objectives that you mentioned, those specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time oriented. And the neat thing is the SMART objective concept goes across so many different industries, but it's also so helpful, because if you can, from the start of a new project or a pandemic or a small outbreak, and that was the thing from public health, is we would use this, whether it was like a small tuberculosis case in a nursing home, but that's how everything starts. It starts and ends locally. So if you use it on small things, then when things get bigger, it's just a matter of scale. So these foundational four concepts. So the first one, SMART objectives, right, is let's figure out what we're all going to work towards. And a super simple way to do that is, hey, everybody, what are the issues? Let's throw them on a whiteboard, put them on sticky notes, do whatever, put them together, get rid of the duplicates, and then kind of put them together. And the overarching, when I was in public health, kind of objective was I had to help support my colleagues in public health to get them ready, train them to be able to provide a 10-day supply of antibiotics to over 300,000 people within 48 hours. So that was always the objective. And then, of course, there's more actionable ones. So if you have things like that, then, and you're practicing it by giving flu shots every year, which isn't quite as emergent, but makes a difference too, or just handing out M&Ms just to go through the process. You still want to have everybody looking at objectives, and at every level, everyone knows what they are. And so the first thing is, let's get everybody together, get some objectives, project team, incident management team, whatever. And then the second thing is an org chart, right? And I'm a pretty visual person, and a lot of folks are. And if I explained these 20 people are doing these things without a visual, it's kind of hard to keep track of that. So very quickly, just boxes and lines together. I mean, really, literally an org chart. Okay, who's doing what? Who's in charge? Who's doing planning? Who's doing logistics? So here's our objectives. Build the org chart, particularly what we call the operations section, or just like any other company, just operations. Who's doing the work? Someone from that operations section that is in the know needs to tell me what the plan's going to be. And that's one thing I found too, is it's whether you're a planning section chief or project managers, a lot of folks look to you to make the plan, but that's not really what we should do. We should facilitate the experts making the plan. And so by helping, having the leadership help us define the objectives, and then the operations folks, the experts, telling us what the meat of the plan should be, we can help with a lot of the other stuff. And so that second of the foundation four of getting, okay, what org chart does this look like? And then we'll work through kind of who's doing specifically what things. But if we can just get that going, then everybody has an idea of who's doing what job, and it cuts down on the silos or cylinders of excellence, as we've called them, duplicate work. It also is a challenge sometimes because one thing, whether it's project incident management, is egos, right? Who wants to be in charge? Who should be in charge? You get into that, but you work it out. Fortunately, practically, sometimes just by having those uncomfortable conversations you have to push through. And this is a great example, right? This pandemic. So traditionally, response is police, fire, EMS, military stuff doing things, and public health isn't typically seen as responders at all. Me, having been in public health, I have a better insight, but most folks don't have any idea that public health all over responds to things. And I mentioned like tuberculosis, whooping cough outbreaks, like all the time. The good thing is most folks don't know, because it's kind of like this. It's kind of freaky to know what diseases are in your backyard. But again, it's good to know. So for something like this, I would look to people's org charts toward their objectives to be chock full of public health people. And that has been, and fortunately, I've had great colleagues along the way to, partner with in police and fire and EMS, and with me in public health, really get into it, and us hoping kind of say, hey, we all have a seat at the table. So let's all build this operations section. So for now, who should be in charge of a disease investigation is like an epidemiologist, not a firefighter, right? And that's hard to get past a lot of times, because fire and police are so response driven, and rightfully so, because gosh, they do awesome stuff. And I have a fire background as well, so it's interesting to decouple that and go, okay, but you can't put more water on a disease, you can't get more security with guns. It doesn't do anything. And I'm finding a lot of folks struggle with that because they haven't practiced. They haven't gotten together and said, hey, for this exercise or for real, let's get some objectives. Let's pull the org chart together. And then, the third of the foundation of four, let's coordinate resources together, which really is, a fancy-ish way of saying just share our stuff. So if we're going to ask for it, let's ask for it early. Often, let's have good, resource coordination together. Through the logistics section or whatever your project team decides. But, so if we're getting our objectives, we've got our org chart, we know who's who, we know how we're going to order stuff and coordinate it, and what people or equipment or supplies we need. Then the fourth thing to me that I kind of added on from what we've do is critical, and it's on every plan. It's also on every after action plan. That's communication. So you can't do the other three things well if you're not communicating. And that's face to face, that's on the phone, that's text, that's whatever modality. Obviously talking about those difficult conversations you have to have when you work a process, the face to face is by far the best. But like right now, we found, face to face is not the greatest way to do that unless you're on the streets or in a hospital or somewhere like that. But so even through Zoom or Skype or messaging or picking up the phone, you can still be direct. I found from both my failures, from team failures I was on, from great successes, that, if you can, one, get your objectives, put an org chart together pretty quickly, coordinate your resources and communicate, the act of just doing those things fills in a ton of other gaps. And you'll, whatever forms you choose to use or, how you document will find its way there. And that's another kind of pitfall some folks get into, is they start to fill out a whole bunch of forms, but they haven't had the conversations. So they have plans that look really great when you look at the piece of paper, but there's really nothing behind them. And so, again, those four things, I think, help people get started. And there's a lot more, detail to work through there, but that's kind of the whole concept.
That's interesting around the paperwork side of things, because that's where things tend to get bottlenecked when people start to put pen to paper and think, and the just to get an action to occur. So, so that becomes like, if it's not signed or ticked and there's lives on the line, you don't have time to go through every piece of paper. So yeah, that stuff should be secondary. Another thing that's interesting that you sort of said there was around experts and making sure that the smartest guy in the room is the guy responsible for that particular role. Because I see at the moment with social media, a lot of people are sharing a lot of information on social media, and they're sharing their family and friends' opinions, and they're not listening to the opinions of experts. And some of the stuff I've seen, and even comments that I've seen made, I just say to people, look, I didn't study 6, 7, 8 years at university to become, immunologist or what is it,
epidemiologist.
Epidemiologist.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, even I can't even say the word. So, so I'm not going to give any advice on stuff I don't know, and not pretend to know something I don't know. And that's the problem, I think, with in this situation we're in right now, is we're all leaning on certain individuals to provide us advice, but at the end of the day, for some, life and death in any situation, not just this one, relies on the advice that you do get from those experts. And if you're listening to the wrong expert or someone who lacks experience, you may receive the wrong advice. So that comes back to the communication side of things. Now, this, people might say, oh, why are we talking about, the crisis and your history? But this is a bit more for you. It is a passion because you've established a podcast, which up on the top left, I think it'll be on everyone's screens, yes, is the name of your podcast, which is, what is it? People, Process, Progress?
Yeah.
I said that correctly. I'm trying to work out the angles. So do you want to explain what you're doing with that podcast and why those 3 words, what that is all about for you?
Absolutely. So when I worked my way up in the incident management world, became an instructor, kind of a mentor on the team, and I love teaching. I love it. I love it mostly not just to hear myself talk, but more when you get to a point in hard training. And that's a good thing about incident management in particular, is the training you go through, you take classes like other stuff, and you have to sit there through PowerPoint slides and other things, but you also have to do. And then you can take all the classes you want, but to get credentialed, you have to be mentored by someone else that's credentialed. So I had to work under or with a planning section chief that already had what's called a task book signed off. And so they watch me in real things or in exercises or both. You have to do them for real. So it's pretty legit process. It's great. And so, once that happened, I could then start to teach and share experience. And you see that aha moment for the student. There's a week-long kind of boot camp class when you first get into incident management. And about the 3rd or maybe 4th day, hopefully a little earlier, because the first couple of days are PowerPoint. We try and make it good, better, but and then you're doing it. And so when you see this is why I can't just go fill the forms out. This is why I need to have that conversation. This is why I shouldn't skip steps, because when you skip steps, to your point, like that's when people get hurt. And if you look at after action reports from really internationally, like bad things that have happened, shootings, attacks, or natural disasters, and almost all of them communication I mentioned. Also, we didn't practice together as in a lot of them, or we didn't train on this. So my passion really became one, loving to see that aha moment, loving to share that, me learning from it, me getting better from incident management, and then applying that to project management. And so I started in September 2018 with what was called Between the Slides, just as a way to not have to travel, to still get the word out. I love podcasts. It's just amazing to me. Like, we're talking across the world, right? It's outstanding. And so I said, you know what? I still want to teach this stuff. I think there's kind of a niche of incident management or project management, so I'm going to push it out there. And then, after about a year, and podcast kind of waxes when you're really into it, and then you're like, oh man, it's a lot of work, but it's really cool. So I kind of rebranded to People, Process, Progress. And as I went through all the iterations of what's catchy or what, and then you get to, okay, what do I know makes a difference? What do I know works versus what's commercially cool? And I know that people drive everything we do in the world, right? There's nature and all that, but it's all people. It's your relationships. It's that you do or don't establish, the communication you do or don't have, all that kind of stuff. People also have process, and that's one thing I found doing project management or incident management or really anything, being a parent, a husband, is there's process like everywhere. It's just sometimes it's small and super simple. Like I get up, I exercise, I brush, whatever. Or I do these prescribed steps to plan for like a presidential debate or, something like that. There's all these different things. And then of course the goal to me of the internet, social media, anything is how do we help each other make progress, and not to be altruistic, but there's enough junk, I'll say, out there, that I think to take what I started off, which was really focused on here's principles from specific courses, and then here's my 2 cents on this and that, and then getting feedback from folks across the world or across the country, and then going, how can this get better? How can that do better? So to me, I really wanted to share people's stories. And so I shared stories from a, third degree jiu-jitsu black belt. I do jiu-jitsu. And what was your story? How did you start your gym? How in the early days, and then talking to, other folks in before of how did you go from being, a new firefighter to the public information officer of your organization. So, and in there's always the process that they used, or specifically, okay, what's the process to special event plan for a sporting event, or what's, and then through that progress, having folks reach out like, man, that really helped when I planned for my next county fair, or, hey, just sharing simple like office exercise things helped me get motivated today. So that's really the driver, is just to put good stuff out there and share from, pitfalls I've had or that I've learned from, that I've done, or successes. And really, I think that's just a great medium to do that.
I think process becomes clearer in hindsight. So when we're in the moment, we're thinking less of the process and more of the moment. And I think when we look at all our successes and failures in combination, it almost seems like a jigsaw puzzle falling in place, which is possibly why some people believe that there is a plan to life, and you don't have you think you're making choices, but you're actually not. That's some people's belief system,
Right.
interestingly. But it sort of makes sense if you're looking in that, through that lens of the process is always something that you can review in hindsight and see that there was actually some method to what might have seemed madness at the time. So
Right.
Now, interestingly, your reference to Between the Slides, which was your previous podcast, and came out of, from what I understand, your training and the concept that you have the slides up on the as you go through a course. Do you want to explain what the concept of Between the Slides actually means for the audience?
Sure. Yeah. I think we've all been at a conference or a class or a meeting, and people stand there and just read you the slides, which as a student and then as an instructor is to me, it's horrible, right? Because I think I could just do that myself. Just email me this and I'll read the slides, and, and we'll show up. And then both as a student, from not just just ever, to being an instructor, of really thinking, again, one, what's a neat sounding name, but the concept being the most value I had as a student to be able to ask people questions was on a break, the 10-minute break between sections, or when you're at lunch with the instructor, or when you're the instructor, you're at lunch with the students, and people relax. They're not fighting a pin. Like, there's, in some of these courses, there's an outbreak in a jail, right? Go figure. So now we're on that times a million across the world. But so they're not stressed out because it's not their familiarity or whatever scenario. And so you get to learn about the person. You learn about why they're there. Were they voluntold to be there? Were they, they heard about this, or they got to, some folks in incident management, like I did, you start being the person with the clipboard that just signs people in, and then you work way up to being in charge of the whole thing. And so, they happened to work one, and they were like, man, I really want to get this training in there. And so over and over again, both for myself and then for students I had, or folks, that I worked with, those pauses, in a break in a meeting or at the conference is by far the most valuable piece, where people can actually relate to each other. And we're not as much, unless it's a really well, which I've been to some of those too, really well kind of set up Q&A type slide decks and always trying to do that. That really when the clicking stops and you can have that conversation, whether it's with the whole class or individually, that's really the value that any course, conference, meeting, etc. Provides. So that was kind of the thought of it.
It's something that I've seen before around the slide stuff. Is I interviewed an individual on the podcast and show People with a Passion named Laurie Kelly, and he has a organisation called Brain Friendly Training, and he had a projector, and when we all walked in the room, he had some weird and wonderful things happening, I must say. In fact, if people are interested, or even yourself, go and look at the episode. It's really interesting. He was a teacher, and he realised how everyone learns differently, and he shows different approaches, and he didn't use a slide. He didn't use slides at all, and he actually said that's the lazy man's way of educating. So
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you said. He said, because if I put slides up, everyone's focused on the slides, they're not focused on me. And you're right, you can send those slides out to them anytime and they can read them in their own time. And a lot of people do sit there thinking, I'm not, I could read that at home. Or they sit there like writing exactly what's up on the slide, which means then they don't give attention to the actual instructor. So what he often did, actually people can go up and have a look, is he basically was writing on paper, and then he'd stick it up around the walls, and he'd just say, when you're ready, he'd let people get up and walk around during the course, and he'd literally let you just take a photo with your mobile phone. He said that's a tool you can use, and that got people up around and moving, and he had all these different methodologies to keep people engaged in the learning process. So the slide thing, to hear you talk about when your learning happened between the slide is
Right.
actually, just springs to mind of that interview and that individual. And there's a lot of methodologies there that absolutely help anyone, not just from an education point of view, like someone like yourself who's instructing people, but also for people to understand how they learn and how they can actually use things like symbols and colours and different approaches to actually learn as well, to help them engage in the learning process. Because most environments are just what you described there, which is everyone just sitting in a room looking at one instructor, and
Right.
and the learning happens in different ways. So for you to identify that, that's pretty good. So who are some of the, you mentioned the jiu-jitsu and things like that in your podcast, who are some of the people that you've had as guests to date and topics that you've covered, to give us an idea of what you're covering there?
One was Andrew Smith. So he was a co-founder of Revolution Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Richmond, where I started, and hopefully to set up the head instructor where I am now. So talked to him most recently on people, process, progress. On Between the Slides, I actually started with my friends and colleagues. Reach out to, hey, what do you think about this episode? And hey, do you want to be on? And the first interview I ever did was, and I don't think it's unique in the U.S., but it was a buddy of mine who was a police captain of 20 plus years in law enforcement's resistance to embracing the incident command system. So the system that brings us all together, and it was from him. So, and he was which is great, a police captain, and so really got into incident management, and it has a lot of the hallmarks you mentioned. So in the trainings and the practice and stuff, we use big sticky notes on the wall and all that kind of, so it's really interactive. And he took it, not, and this I think speaks to people's perceptions on, oh well, we can only use this one thing in this big stuff. So he took the whole, which is a pretty big system, and said, well, wait a minute, when I go to a call that's like a homicide or a break-in or whatever, we can spin up the same kind of things we talked about. And so he was the first one I talked to, a good friend of mine, and really sharing a lot of not just law enforcement, but any industry that holds on to their we've always done it this way thing, or we've always done an operations order, so we don't need all those forms, was the perception that they had, not knowing the process that is behind all of those. It's, they don't show up magically. So talked to him about that, and a couple other buddies that came up through the fire service. Another gentleman, Ben Rogers, who has the Bottom Line podcast actually too, but he was our realtor. inspired. And again, I wish it was people process, because he was a great example of, hey, we met you because you helped us sell our house. And then we became friends. And his story is he started exercising a lot, got healthy, survived a house fire when he was younger. Like, great story, right, in his process. And now he's a successful realtor and a coach and things like that. So kind of a mix of people like that. And talked to another buddy who's a firefighter and does like suicide support for first responders. So pretty, public safety or incident management heavy, but not completely. And really trying to kind of branch out and just expand that so it really fits, and part of that's me, the time of, hey, set everything up and get it scheduled and do this kind of that. So it's been a mix, but really starting with kind of what I was most familiar with and people I was most familiar with, and then branching out to some other folks.
It's interesting with emergencies that they're flowing situations where any sense of planning may actually not work if you have that fixed mindset around this is how we always did it. So I'm sure multiple times you see that in an emergency situation. So how do you actually address that situation when it does occur, when you've got a number of people and or experts saying this is how we've always done it?
Well, sometimes you have to be very political and soft-handed, depending on the position you're in. If say, when I was an EMS captain, which is good because of my leadership, and then, working with other folks, was fortunate to be in a position where I could influence, because I'd kind of earned my spot, but more so I developed relationships. And there's no getting around in public safety that what's on your collar matters when you meet someone, right? So working through that kind of, but really then making it the human connection. So sometimes having to do the political game and do that. And then sometimes just being frank and this, again, this sparked, it's no mystery or no dig. It just happened to be with law enforcement that they do this operations order. It's very paramilitary, right? That's, where it comes from, the background. And so we've done this, but it's good for you, but it's not good for any of your other partners, meaning, cool, that's a great plan for law enforcement, but it doesn't help fire, and it doesn't help EMS, and it doesn't help dispatch and anybody else if you do it that way. And there's plenty of great examples of folks that don't do that. And so, one time I had to have a very frank discussion saying, and this is when I was coordinating like EMS task forces to stand by to go in and grab people and get them out, and to say, look, if you're, because people would say, and this person in particular, I don't care about all those forms, and it's just this, and not understanding. No, it's the conversations we have, and we know we're on the same radio channels, and we, all the stuff that's important, of saying, look, if your person gets hit in the head with a brick, my people can't get to you because we have no idea where they are, right? So sometimes you have to put it in a tangible context that matters to that person. Hopefully before then they could have seen the process and been in the meetings and went, oh yeah. But I've gone out of meetings that was the day before, and folks are looking at their radio, turning the channel going, well, I guess we'll use this channel, which is a nightmare, right? Because ahead of time you need to know, on a sunny day, here's our channel. When it gets a little bit worse, we might move some folks. When one of our people go down, right, you don't have time to sit there. And I mentioned there's after actions from big events like, Las Vegas or other stuff. And again, it's different practicing it than really responding and being able to do it and that kind of stuff. And I get it, but you can see the same message. And so I've had to just been straightforward with folks, sometimes to a fault, sometimes I've been a little too straightforward, but for the instances where it's a civil unrest you're planning for, where it could go completely sideways like things have, some folks only understand that real direct approach. And then, other times when you have time, when it's a planned event, you just, build a good relationship and bring people on board and put them in positions where they have authority or they're part of the team there, so they can learn, but also help make decisions. It's just good kind of team building and confidence building, because I found most folks don't know what they don't know, and they're nervous about that. So that's a lot of why they put the wall up, and they fall back on what is a good practice for them that they've done for 20 years, but not understanding, wow, oh, you can get us snacks and water also, not just for police and fire, not just for your patch. And so when you provide value for other partners, that also makes a huge difference. And that we've done that before, where it's really just let us get you food and help do logistics for that. right? And you kind of chip away, and then they realize, oh, this is part of a much bigger process. Same thing with a project, if it was the private sector or something else, it very similar parallels.
You're currently working in a health environment in a logistical, more, I guess it's logistical IT support role or project management role. What are you seeing on the ground right now with the current situation, given that most of the people in that medical, and it's an academic environment, but they're still involved in what's going on because it is a medical facility?
Yeah, very, similar to probably what almost every other healthcare organization is seeing as far as surge capacity for bed space and staffing, and how do we minimize use of personal protective equipment but still maintain contact with the patient, the providers, a consultant that's not even in the hospital, and a huge resurgence of telehealth, telemedicine. How do we implement that for folks in the hospital, for folks outside the hospital? And then, that's primarily day to day. So I'm an IT project manager. So usually it's, hey, we have a new vital signs device that does this or that. Let's integrate it with our electronic health record, make sure we hand it off good, it works, cool. So I'm actually finding I'm putting half of my incident command system hat on because I'm actually using processes and forms directly from that. And I just kind of change it and sneak it in there. But it helps, not just to do it. And then also kind of traditional project management, communications and updates and things like that. But really focused on the tactical. And you're right, I'm really doing a lot of logistical stuff and just helping close communication gaps. And, let's get these devices so we can, and really finding which is amazing, these things that folks look at all the time, these smartphones are a huge enabler. If you think about it, if you put a phone and leave them in rooms where there's patients that, and there's ways to do it, either a holder or the patient holds it, and I'm outside the phone and I can FaceTime you or Zoom you or something else, I don't have to wear any PPE, short of whatever zone of the hospital you're in, because there's still, kind of hot and cold and warm zone. But it's a great multiplier, and the quality of the video is awesome. And a lot of the carriers, I think, are, have bumped up their signal, because I would love to see the graphs of the spike of activity and things like that. So really focus on enabling that, and then just trying to help kind of overall communication and organization, stuff like that.
The interesting thing around what's happening right now is technology's been used and applied as tools in so many different ways, and people are looking at the opportunity to identify how things may be used. So that's an interesting use of the mobile phone there, given, you can't have that close interaction with someone that may be infected or is infected. Interestingly, I sold on dropshipping oximeters, the ones that go on fingers last year, and I see that they're in short supply right now. But one of the things that people are using, they connect to the mobile phones via Bluetooth, some of them, and they actually record the oxygen levels for the doctors, and they can check in on the oxygen level in the app, because it gets emailed to them. So I'm not sure if the hospital's using those, but I think they're thin on the ground at the moment. But the idea is because they're monitoring the oxygen levels, that it's helping them assess the patient's level of or where they're at, I suppose, is the way to put it. So even that technology, where they used to put people onto machines, is actually being used to measure their oxygen levels, which is so important given it's a respiratory disease. So that's certainly working there. In emergency situations, obviously a lot of situations, they only go for a short period of time, and they're emergency. You get in, you get out, you get the job done. But in a situation like this, where we're talking potentially months, hopefully not years, but certainly months, how do you maintain morale in an environment where you've got multiple emergency services and personnel, where they're seeing from a day-to-day basis, they're on the ground working in crisis mode?
It's tough, and for now, honestly, for me, being kind of afar, helping coordinate, but connected, and talking with some of the folks that are on the ground, it's very hard. It's exhausting. It's morally demoralizing, and from the standpoint of everyone that I know that's in public safety or public health or healthcare, you want to save everyone. You want to do the best that you can. You want to help them have all the best conversations, and and something this big, you can't. And so the good thing I'm seeing is a lot of, whether it's employee assistance program or other counseling programs that are available, mental health, stress management, is very helpful. Talking to each other, we get together, friends and I that I was on the incident management teams with and public safety. And, when you talk with folks that have gone through similar experiences and you can just talk it out, it helps tremendously. Letting yourself not, and this was a big thing in public safety in the military too, that unfortunately because of the wars, but because of those, that it's less stigma to, there's nothing wrong if you've, so upset and you're crying, there's nothing wrong to get mad. There's just nothing wrong with it, but bottling it up is, a problem. And so, overall morale is tough, but then, for the teams I'm on, for my friends that I talk to, it's just lift each other up. Sometimes you're the one that's up and you're helping everybody else, and sometimes you're the one that's down and they're helping you. Particularly for like me, I have 3 sons. My wife's working from home. School is out, but still curriculum, which is a whole nother podcast, a whole nother thing like that. But so that is tough when we're all busy, and I'm in healthcare, and my wife's working to help keep a software company going and all of that. And it's giving yourself time, I think, to go step outside, take a breath, get in a routine. And this is something I think that's really important that has helped me, and I think other folks, is still get up like you're going to work, still get ready, still do your exercise, still do whatever, work somewhere, make it quiet. So I think that helps with managing the stress. But healthcare, public safety in particular, are just hurting because as much as, I know I was fortunate to work with great folks and do some great work. You can only scale up for pretend or even the real stuff you do so much to something this magnitude, and then you're going to run out of people, you're going to run out of supplies, you're going to run out of space. But I think it's, helping folks be okay with that. Like, hey, this good solution is great. Because, in a mentor I had, doctor I used to work for, perfect is the enemy of good sometimes was a great analogy he gave me when I'd sit there and try to get this right and get it right. And he's like, hey, like that's a good solution. And so I think, we're doing a lot of that now. And short of some huge safety violation or, something like that, is just do the best you can, because we're in crisis mode until, the peak's gone and, everything starts to get kind of better. So I think folks are just working through it by, again, ebb and flow. When you're up, help others. And when you're down, ask for help, or just take time to let your emotions out, go for a walk, that kind of stuff.
So is that something you consider in an org chart, is having some sort of system of support as well for those that are on the ground working hands-on in a crisis or emergency?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other hat I used to wear on the incident management team was medical unit leader. And so that was the medical person for us, right? And it's medical focus because the kind of history of the incident command system is it came from the big wildfires out west. And so I would have to show up in a forest and set up like an EMS system kind of thing. But in the all hazards world, or just the day-to-day kind of in a city or a county world, we would still do that. And so part of that is, are you looking at how people are? Are you both health-wise, doing screenings, that kind of stuff? In a hospital healthcare system, or like friends of mine are part of a regional effort, so multiple localities, cities or counties together. Do you have mental health services there to look after folks or give them a number? And they do. And then sharing I mentioned employee assistance programs, which has the counseling available, or sharing regional first responder networks. And there's a bunch of those things online and sharing that. But you definitely should focus on not just kind of the tactical stuff and not just, the high speed things, but okay, what about your person? This was the first time they saw someone deceased, or this was the 50th, there's different, stresses there. And so how are you going to manage them? And for, any special event you plan, or even critical incident you go to, that debrief, that looking at your folks should always be included in it.
Interestingly, time period like this, you mentioned, people and how they react to seeing one body and how they may react after seeing 50, which sent me off on a little bit of a tangent to an interview that I just did with an undertaker. He told me how he first was when he was dealing with corpses, and then when you said your first dealing is different to your 50th, and I'm thinking, my mind went to wonder how many he's worked with and how he thinks about them after time.
One of the things I was talking about studies about was a big public health preparedness thing is mass fatality management. Yeah. And so it's also one of those things that nobody wants to talk about till you have to.
In a crisis like now, where health is also an issue, and talking public health in general, we're
Right.
seeing that people aren't being able to be given their traditional burials, that they're having to dig like trenches in New York and places like that to place people, because health is becoming a bigger issue around those. So, do you want to talk about that whole concept of when it gets to that point where, we've had that much loss of life?
Sure. There's, I guess, a couple kind of main streams there typically, and there's a whole list, at least under the CDC, that my state health department kind of looked to for guide. And there's crisis standards of care. So that's when you get to a point where we don't have enough people and stuff, so we have to do the greatest good for the greatest number, and that's probably the front end of what we're talking about. Where okay, and you see a lot of this now. So hey, if you think you have it, stay home for 14 days. Is because we don't want every single person coming to the emergency room or to the hospital or whatever clinic, because you can't, no clinic nowhere on earth, we can't handle that. So part of it is that. The other part, the extreme of that crisis standards of care, is we have 3 breathing tubes left and 5 people need them. That's a whole and if you think about, that's a heavy psychological thing just right now to talk about, let alone actually planning for that or having to do it. And so that's a whole big thing. And there's some of that with, I think ventilators is probably the best example that you see, the shortages and who gets one and who doesn't and who can we treat without it. And that's a crisis standard of care decision and discussion. And then the poor outcome of that is what you just mentioned. So now this mass fatality management, which has always been kind of a hot potato, because one, it's hard to imagine things would get that bad, that the medical examiner or the morgue is filled, the funeral homes are filled, the hospital's filled, there's no space, but it's something that we plan for, and that the logistics of that is a whole different thing, to the point of, if you think about it, the practical aspect of thinking, what are we going to do with people's remains? And there's all the different factors of legal custody of it, religious rights, depending on what their beliefs are, of storage of the body, right? And so, a practical, just as an example of, and having gone through some of this planning with emergency management and public safety colleagues, of how can we store if there was a mass fatality of like 20 people, and they have there's a thing in the hospital, and you may have seen it, it's a cooling blanket. It's like this plastic blanket, the cool stuff goes through, and usually it's because I overheated or something. Well, they have a concept of those that's a small trailer, but it's made for body storage. But it holds like 6 to 10, maybe. I'm sure they have some that are bigger. When you talk big scale, you're talking like refrigerated semi truck, right? Is kind of the probably movie is the best, like some Contagion movie or something like that. And so, when you think about the practical planning of it, if who uses a lot of refrigeration trucks is like fruit vendors, right, or food. But if they know that you had to use that to store bodies, now you own that truck. Right, because both the public and the company probably doesn't want it back. And so when you think about planning, so then going, okay, well, what else could we use? Well, they also use that for seedlings, like for plants, right? And so thinking, oh, well, that could be an option, and getting down to the level of working out partnerships with those companies to say, okay, if we get to this point, how can we call you to help us to set it up wherever you've planned for it? Is that mass fatality, management, and partnering? We did partner with our funeral directors, that's their expertise. Undertaker funeral directors is, how do you appropriately, with respect and religious rights and legal custody, manage care of a human being, let alone tens, 20s, hundreds of them, and then how can you, and with limited capacity. So the experts, in that mass fatality planning are folks that deal with fatalities all the time, and including, for us, it's the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, the folks that do the investigation. How did this person die? And it's usually from an unnatural kind of cause, but they're also experts. So bringing those people to the table should help drive your planning. And then people that are really good at logistics and getting stuff. And the example we always used in some of the short courses we would teach folks is like Radar O'Reilly from the show MASH. He could get everything, like anything you needed. And so if you have really good logistics folks, that kind of seedling truck idea or partnerships, thinking outside the box, really can make a difference. Because, I mean, like you mentioned, seeing either the term mass grave or seeing on the news, what looks like that is just, it's very hard to digest, and it kind of, beckons back to kind of wartime where there are bombs dropping and there are, things like that. And so, but yeah, getting into the practical elements of those, you have to dig and you have to get that on paper. So if someone years down the road picks it up and it's actionable, though, it's, hey, if you get to these levels, call these numbers and work with those folks.
The media you just touched on, when we see those things in the media,
Right.
how big a role, given you brief media and they tend to report as they see fit, especially in the US where it is a free press and it's something that's held in high regard. Usually, it's only as good as, like anything. People, what is it? People process progress. It's only as
Right.
good as the people that are involved and where they come from, I suppose, and what they're. Everyone has an agenda. So I have a journalism background, and I chose not to do newspapers for a reason. I like radio, but I chose not to do
Gotcha.
newspapers for a reason. Meaning because the gatekeepers, the owners are the gatekeepers of the message. So that's not true journalism to me. So regardless of, this is my opinion now, regardless
Sure.
of which organisation someone reports for, they are employed, and that makes an issue. So I like the democratisation of broadcasting in podcasting, because it actually gives people more of a voice and not beholden to anyone. So there, I said my piece. I'm allowed to say that because I'm not being paid. So,
Yeah.
but
Right.
but yeah. So let's talk about the things that you not can't necessarily control in that you may seem as important. So media is one of them right now. We can see your president gets a lot of heat for how he's being reported, and he gives a lot of heat for how he's being reported. But how hard is it in a crisis to try and have some form of narrative that is actually not a grey, like a grey area, as opposed to black and white, because people are looking for black and white in a crisis. When it becomes grey, misinformation and the correct information become hard to discern. So how does that, from a crisis management point, become part of your organisational planning?
It's huge between, and there's two key kind of in a typical incident command system kind of structure. There's the public information officer. So often, which is great, they were in journalism or studied it or had some capacity. Some came up and trained maybe in their department. They were like, the police department's PIO as a positional, but a lot of them were experts in their field like you. So how do you tell a story? How do you, put things together? And so we leverage that, and that public information officer's job for the entire incident management team or command system or project, if it's media, but particularly the public information officer, is to let us know on the team, here's how we're going to put messages out. So it's one message, one voice, nothing, no one talks to the media, or here's some general statements. Very similar, to probably what we're seeing, but everything goes through me. If the media calls you, let me know what channel they're from, all that kind of stuff. So it's a person everyone knows is the point for any messages going out or coordinating briefings, putting together what we call the joint information system, which is all the PIOs from various organizations. If we were on a, not in a pandemic, but where we had to be co-located, let's say there was like a stadium collapse, something big, and there wasn't a pandemic, they would coordinate a joint information center. So just a place for everyone to show up and do briefings, and then also brief, the incident commander. And the example you used is the president, right? Our commander in chief. So briefing them, and then, the unknown is, are they going to go on or off script, which is, is the question. And then having similarly, when we do briefings to the troops, the operations briefing, which is, we do all this process, we put it together, and then we need to tell the people we're going to send out there to do things, whether it's our people initially, that's our primary focus, that we're sharing that message with them effectively, and then also how we tell them the public, like if there's a big missing persons, hey, you'll see all these people and here's why, and those kind of things. And then there's kind of an internal a position called the liaison officer, and their job is, how is everybody playing together in the sandbox? Do we have the contacts for all the partner organizations? And that's just as important. So rumor control within the team, messages within the team, contacts within the team, or organizations or departments, or project team members, and the public information officer, how we pushing messages out, how we coordinating with the media. So they're critical roles, and we see that now, and in standard special event planning or incident response, there's definitely a rumor control aspect of that, standardizing messages, putting those together. So it's critically important. And, now what I've told folks and what I look at always is, for us, the CDC, as far as information, is it, right? And so that's, for me, being in the U.S. and the kind of programs I was under, who we always went to. And I know there's a lot of information with the WHO. For us, that's just what I went to. And, it's near real time, and that was it. So also having a source that you trust, and, if it was a different circumstance, what's the definitive authority on X, and so that's what we're going to use. And so everybody's data points are the same. And, that ties into a good message that's legitimate, that's not. And I've had this from family and friends. My brother's cousin's sister works at the Pentagon, and they said this is going to happen, and it's Marshall, all the stuff, and you're going, okay, let's vet that. And I think some principles of personal preparedness is to have a plan, whether it's for a fire or a pandemic or something like that. Put a kit together, like food that'll last, and that's one thing. So the message that we're pushing out to folks, that I'm seeing we can probably improve on, because you've seen in the stores the whole toilet paper thing, but and then people buying perishable like chicken breasts and ground beef. And so we've also seen hurricanes are still happening, or tornadoes or earthquakes or whatever, and they don't care about the pandemic. So all that chicken you just bought, now you don't have power, now it's going to go bad, versus some shelf stable food like cans of tuna, or they have whole meal, those kind of things. So that public information messaging too, which we do see a lot of the distancing and wear a mask or don't wear a mask, gloves, and so that's a huge aspect too. And even that has variability depending on probably what channel you're watching, and and where you're watching and who's giving the message. And so for that's another big aspect of those. But another key component of preparedness is stay informed. So choose your sources wisely, get them from your emergency services or emergency management organization that's in your area, or public health.
Yeah, so it's interesting that it must be tough for you to be watching some things in this crisis and how it's being managed right now. Not that you're correct, but it's because you're coming from a perspective where you feel you can help. And you're probably looking at things going, gee, why have they done that? But we're talking about hindsight. So when this is all said and done, how important is it to review the whole process of everything that's occurred here to try and learn from it and improve those, processes, so that in the future we progress when these things occur?
I think it's critical, and just put a, kind of one of the spur of the moment, hey, let me give some scoop on how you do an after action or lessons learned on the fly. And I think we now should be collecting these, jotting down notes daily or weekly, so that in a month, 2 months, 3 months, we're not trying to recall, from the how do we do this one task or two tasks in this either healthcare facility or out in the street or wherever, to how do we do this whole thing better. I think it's, and there's, I'll probably butcher the quote, but, if we ignore history, we're doomed to repeat it, kind of thing. And again, we see that. So, after 9/11, after Katrina, at least in the U.S., we looked at, okay, let's do better warning, and okay, let's get more hurricane stuff, and then shootings, let's get more response gear. And then this, I would imagine there'll be a surge of masks and gowns and stocking up. And I've always been way before, if you've partnered, if you've done some of the things we've talked about, you already kind of can project, hey, maybe let's get a couple extra of these, but not everything. And so I think we won't as a whole planet, let alone your organization or anyone, benefit or actually get better if we're not objective with ourselves and our organizations on doing good after action reports. So, from the most basic of get your teams together and say, give me 3 areas for improvement each, give me 3 strengths. Let's put all those together. Let's write a comprehensive, no nonsense kind of thing. And we should be honest in, what, we probably could have practiced this process better, or we should have planned that out more, or, there's no getting around when I think humans in general, if something bad's not happening or this scenario hasn't played out, we kind of brush it aside. And then if it's part of a checklist we're supposed to do, we go, yeah, cool, yeah, we did that. But now we're seeing, oh man, we really have to do that. So particularly in the area of continuity of operations, which is about how do we have 2 or 3, 4 people deep in one position to rotate them out, or, because now we mentioned morale earlier, you can only work going 14, 15-hour days for not that long before you're not helpful, and then recognizing, okay, how do we make that better? So I hope that folks are going to do that, and put those together. But I imagine there'll be some variability because, again, you see it after every kind of big thing. It gets a lot of spotlight and then it falls away. And so I hope we don't do that. I hope folks really take it to heart and make a big difference, because it's a lot of this. I think my 2 cents, and like you mentioned, it's kind of my 2 cents based on my background. I think we could do a lot of things that don't even involve buying a lot of stuff or spending a lot of money. It's really maybe some training and just getting together and talking through things or practicing, which it's not hard. The obstacle there is really us.
One thing that I think this is relevant, it seems we're talking about the crisis, but this whole concept of process and crisis management is relevant to individuals' daily lives and businesses as well. So businesses, should have things in place for when things aren't going well within their organisations. Individuals right now experiencing adversity, you said that there should be crisis kits and things like that, where they should be considering what they're buying and things like that, so that if something happens, they've mitigated against it. So more or less a pre-mortem as opposed to a post-mortem. And I'm just wondering, what advice would you be giving to individuals right now around how they can better organise their lives to mitigate against some of the potential things that may not yet be seen?
I think so. Fortunately, if kind of like those foundational for personal preparedness is kind of that gap that I'm seeing, or that message is there. It exists a lot of places, but maybe that's something we haven't packaged and pushed out well enough across the world, really, and in the U.S. for sure, is the first thing is have a plan, whether it's for fire, whether it's a bad guy in your house, whether it's, there's a pandemic, or the biggest scenario that's used in these cases is like there's a hurricane and you lose power for a week. And the guidance has typically been have enough food and water and other stuff for like 3 days, which we are way beyond, obviously. And the good thing is, though, we're not globally like without power and the whole neighborhood devastated, so that's kind of the extreme, but is to have a plan from the simplest thing to the most complex like this, and there's a lot of good templates out there, and if folks just Google, we have like ready.gov, there's probably similar national or state level things for their emergency management, is look up the templates they have for emergency personal preparedness plans. The second thing is make a kit, and that is have flashlights, not candles, have non-perishable or shelf-stable food, and that's the food, that's like the noodles that you can open and eat, or you could microwave and it's tasty, a little better, but in a pinch you could eat it, right? Or tuna or something like that. Your medications, that's a big one that we're seeing now too. So if you can't get to your doctor and for storms, you can see a hurricane coming. I know there's debate on whether everyone saw this coming, and not to go down that road, but a storm is on a map, and so that's the example that's typically used is, okay, we're 2 weeks out from hurricane whatever, going to hit us really hard. Call your doctor, get 2 extra weeks of meds if you can, and there's things like that, and practically have extra water, not just for the adults. If you have babies, have extra water and formula and diapers. So just think practically in your kit, what would you need to sustain yourself at your place with no help? And I think that's also depending on probably where you live in the world, let alone your state, your country, et cetera, of the perception of, well, if something happens, someone will just come help me, versus I need to be able to do this myself. And we're certainly seeing that, right? Because there's not capacity when everyone has problems to help everyone. And so if you can have water, have food, have the necessities you need to keep your health up. If you're staying in that routine, then your kit kind of should include those vital things: phone chargers, extra batteries, those kind of things. And then stay informed is like what we talked about before. So use trusted, enjoy, all the various things on social media, that's accurate or not, but kind of learn and find your way, get different viewpoints on what's happening, find out who the authority is. Have a radio, like old school radio with batteries, or a wind up one that's a radio and flashlight, so you can hear, hey, this is for now, probably the equivalent is, hey, we're doing COVID testing at this time at this place. And, but the radio would be a tornado warning, something like that. It's very storm based, this concept, but it works for pandemics too. The thing is, most folks can't stock up their own ventilator and their own suits and all that kind of stuff. And then the fourth one of those that is, kind of optional, so to speak, is to get involved, right? So if you are prepared, if you've got a plan for folks, if you're inclined, when, now is probably a hard time to do it, but there's volunteer organizations, and we have the Medical Reserve Corps, which is something we have, and community emergency response teams, and all these different, whether it's medical based or not, of where you can help your community, you can get extra training. And that just makes you even more prepared personally, let alone you can be part of the community. And I've, got about 6.5 years as a volunteer firefighter, and it's invaluable experience. Plus you get to meet people from all walks of life. You get the invaluable experience of, if a disaster or an emergency happens to you and you've kind of been in those situations before, whether it's health or public safety or something else, then it helps you get used to it. But so, having a plan, making that kit with practical, stuff in it, staying informed and getting involved if you choose, is probably personally the message I think probably needs to be resounded, for sure now and afterwards. And it's not too late to put some of that stuff together now.
Thanks for your time, Kevin Pannell. And if people are interested, make sure you check out the People, Process, Progress podcast, and you'll get more great advice on these sorts of situations. So really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. Good to speak with you and learn more about you and hear more about people with passion.
Thanks, mate.
I hope you liked this episode. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and feel free to comment. If you haven't yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to be advised of new interviews when they're uploaded. I hope you join us again sometime. Catch you later.